Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the news of a hefty suspension waiting for an MP, which presents a tasty by-election prospect, which I'll discuss, but also how the way the suspension was recommended could be an indicator that Boris Johnson will indeed escape of a serious suspension for his own Partygate transgressions. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So it's April the 1st, and by the time this is published, it's supposed to be no more April Fool's jokes because I've had enough of them. My own equipment has been playing pranks on me. First of all, I sit here and I'm waiting to do this, and then the wrong script's copied across. Then I come back and I try it again, and I press the record button and it goes, oh, I'm not really going to record. So I spot that as well. So my own equipment is trolling me this morning. But anyway, never mind. In amongst all the noise this week from another worthless Brexit deal, the Orange One's indictment in America, and Finland joining NATO, thus basically doubling the length of border that Russia has with NATO countries, there was a very interesting situation developing in Westminster this week, and it's got two main areas of interest. But I want to discuss the window into Boris Johnson's Partygate inquiry that it represents first. So Margaret Ferrier, formerly an SNP MP before she lost the whip, she was convicted for a COVID offence, just like Boris Johnson, actually. In Ferrier's case, she travelled on public transport whilst knowing she was infected with COVID. So no argument about it, incredibly stupid, reckless and selfish. But as well as the criminal conviction, she also faced an investigation by the Standards Committee, reputation of Parliament and all that. Now, a bit of essential background here. The Standards Committee, which usually decides matters like this, comprises MPs from the Privileges Committee, which is currently investigating Boris Johnson's Partygate lies, plus some others who aren't MPs, lay people. The chair of the Standards Committee is the Standards Commissioner, again, not an MP. So when suspensions are normally decided, or whether indeed MPs have breached the standards, it tends to be a mix of MPs and non-MPs. The reason the Privileges Committee is investigating Boris Johnson because it's really a breach of the ministerial code, not just being an MP. So this is the Standards Committee. And it's the Standards Committee which Boris Johnson tried to dissolve in 2021 when they recommended a lengthy suspension for Owen Paterson for breaching lobbying rules, basically bribery and corruption. Johnson got his MPs to vote to disband the entire committee in order to stop the suspension. But there was a bit of a public backlash. In fact, it was quite fierce. A few days later, Tory MPs with their tails between their legs were forced to have another vote in Parliament to reinstate the committee. All very embarrassing for the Tories, for Johnson, certainly for Owen Paterson. It was the beginning of the public losing faith in Johnson, and then that was then the ideal time for Partygate. Because remember, Partygate was reported a long time after it happened. Clearly, people were waiting for Johnson to be in a weakened position, and this is what weakened him. So anyway, now this Standards Committee, which was reinstated a few days later, has recommended a suspension of 30 days for Ferrier. Now, that's a spicy suspension. But, she broke the law, she endangered the public, and, of course, failed to show the necessary leadership that you would expect of legislators to the public at a time when the conduct of politicians needed to be exemplary during a tough period. And, of course, you will say, and you'll be quite right, that there were MPs from various political parties were all found to have breached the rules. Some of them got away with it completely. There was no investigation, even though they clearly broke the law. And some of them even photographed themselves breaking the law. Some people will argue there's an injustice. But in this isolated example, there's no argument. Even if others got away with poor behaviour, Ferrier certainly committed a serious breach. But then you think, so surely Boris Johnson's breach was, if anything, more serious in terms of reputation of Parliament and all the rest of it. Because outside of her local area, most people don't really know who Ferrier is. She's just a backbench MP. Other than this news, that is. But Johnson's undermining of his own rules are well known throughout the country. He massively undermined the credibility of the whole government as well as Parliament. And he broke the law into the bargain. And it was his own law. So surely if Ferrier gets a 30-day suspension, Johnson must get at least, even if somehow it's not considered as serious, it's surely got to be at least the 10 days required to trigger a recall petition. You would think so. But then I heard something interesting. So I'd already talked recently about how there are rumours that enough of the Privileges Committee have already decided to be lenient with Johnson. Now, I don't know whether this is true or not, but it is being reported seriously. You know, there's talk of Johnson accepting a lesser charge of recklessly misleading Parliament. Really don't know what it's got to do with him, you know, but that is the news we're getting, that he will accept a charge of recklessly misleading Parliament as opposed to deliberately doing so. All pointing to laying the groundwork for a suspension of less than 10 days. Now, listen to this. Although the Standards Committee are recommending a 30-day suspension for this former SNP MP, 4 members of the committee, who are all MPs, wanted to make the suspension 9 days instead. Now, not only would this be way more lenient than 30, but importantly, just below the threshold required to trigger a recall petition. So who were the members who voted for the 9-day suspension rather than 30, which everyone else went along with? Well, Alan Dorrans, who's an SNP MP, and you go, okay, some party political loyalty or considerations there, or, you know, talk about as much as you like, but nothing unusual about that. Ferrier is no longer an SNP MP, of course, but Dorrans might have some regard for her on a personal level, or he may just be acting out of party political interest, you know, to prevent a tricky by-election for Humza Yousaf so early on into his leadership. But I'll get onto that in a moment. But the other 3 votes were from Tory MPs. Now, you may remember them from Johnson's hearing because they're also members of the Privileges Committee. Sir Bernard Jenkins, Sir Charles Walker, Alberto Costa, all of them put Johnson under quite a lot of pressure during that hearing. They asked some very tricky questions, and in a couple of cases in a very tricky way. But here they are voting against the rest of the committee to try and get a former SNP MP, one of their opponents, a lenient enough sentence to avoid her losing her seat. Now, there's no real party political reason for them to do that unless, and this is the suggestion, unless there's some justification for also giving Boris Johnson a lenient punishment. After all, how would it look giving a backbench MP that no sod's heard of, outside of her own region anyway, a 30-day suspension for breaching COVID rules on one occasion, albeit seriously, and then a 9-day suspension for Boris Johnson, who breached them multiple occasions, and it became publicly known, so and then lied in Parliament about it, thus trashing the reputation of Parliament and the government. That would look quite bad, you know. And although these MPs were outnumbered in the Standards Committee, so the recommendation from the Standards Committee is this 30-day suspension, it's a different matter in the Privileges Committee. The Privileges Committee only has 7 members. So if 4 of them vote for a 9-day suspension, then a 9-day suspension is what is recommended by the whole committee. That being said, as I say, if MPs vote to approve this 30-day suspension for Ferrier, I think there's going to be some questions asked by the public about why Johnson only gets a 9-day suspension, because the public aren't going to look at the intricacies of all this. All they will see is 30-day suspension for a backbench MP breaking COVID rules on one occasion, 9-day suspension voted for by Tory MPs for Boris Johnson, who broke them all the time and then lied about it. A little tricky there, a little tricky. But nonetheless, this trying to get Ferrier a 9-day suspension, that is strong evidence that they're going to try. It's not proof, but it is strong evidence that they're going to try, because there isn't really much of a compelling reason for Tory MPs to go out of their way to let off a former MP from the SNP. But that's one interesting aspect to the news. The other is that, so let's say MPs now accept this suspension. They could reject it. MPs could vote to reject the suspension. They could say, no, we think that's too much. That is possible. But let us say that they don't reject the suspension. So a recall petition will then be issued. If 10% of the voters in that constituency sign it, Ferrier is recalled from Parliament. She's no longer an MP. There will then be a by-election. The by-election will be quite tasty. Now, right now, electoral calculus reckons that Labour are very strong favourites to take the seat. But I will point out a couple of factors to consider. First of all, this sort of polling, it might work well enough for sort of a national picture. It is very good. It does take account of regional differences, but it bases that on considering types of voters and how they're distributed. So if a particular candidate adds a lot of value, so some seats, people they're just voting for the party or maybe the party leader. But in some seats, the candidate does add value. So that can shift things a little bit. Secondly, the voting intention polls in Scotland are in flux right now due to uncertainty over the new leadership of the SNP. This by-election, if it occurs at all, will not be for some time. So the polls will have changed again. You know, the suspension, first of all, the process, the suspension has to be ratified by the House of Commons before it can take effect. They're now on a 3-week Easter recess, so that's not happening anytime soon. I don't even know if it will happen immediately when they return. If MPs do vote to support the suspension, and again, that's not certain, but, you know, if they do, a recall petition is then issued. So that can last for up to 6 weeks. Although if 10% of the voters sign it before then, obviously the process ends more quickly. It ends as soon as 10% sign it or 6 weeks has passed. So then if 10% of constituents sign it, and you would think they would, then there needs to be a writ issued in Parliament for the by-election. Now, because the SNP previously held the seat, they are the ones who get to decide when to do that. They can't just hold off them for 2 years or anything. But it is sort of up to them to decide the timing as long as they don't take the mickey. So they may decide they want to delay it a little bit if they think they need another month or so to shore up support. So the by-election, under any circumstances, will be months away. It could easily be after summer. Could be like October or something. By this time, Humza Yousaf may well have stabilised SNP polling. He may well have got it back in the right direction from his point of view. Or he may have turned it into a Liz Truss level skip fire. Who knows? We'll just have to wait. But whatever the polling says right now, this is a seat that will be between the SNP and Labour. And regardless of what people think is the likelihood one way or the other, it will be a fight between them and either could take it. It will give Labour a new test, because they've won back a former red wall Tory seat in a by-election. That was under Boris Johnson with Partygate in full swing. This would be a much better test. Labour winning what will be a key Scottish target for them at the next general election. As for Yousaf, key test as well. Classic case for both Starmer and Yousaf. A win giving them a real boost to give their supporters belief, and a loss being a bit of a jolt to the system and getting people to question, do you really know what you're doing? Both parties will throw the kitchen sink at this by-election. But like I say, it's not going to happen for a long time yet. And it's not absolutely certain to happen at all. Because, as I say, Tory MPs, what if Tory MPs vote against it in order to prevent it making it awkward to give Boris Johnson a lenient punishment? But there we are. Those are my thoughts for now. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.